Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for Habits Part 6. 6 week doing this. And if you're watching here in sunny West Michigan, it is a beautiful day. So all the more hats off to you if you are in front of a computer screen right now. Maybe you're watching this later on too. We have a lot of people that shared this and watched it. So thanks for sharing it. Thanks for joining us. I'm so excited to talk with Dr. Clint Usher, who's been a friend over the years. We were just talking about some crazy ministry things that we've overlapped in over the years. And Clint lives in Christchurch, New Zealand, which is not only very far from where we're filming this in West Michigan, but is also an American citizen. So he's lived here, lived in West Michigan for a while, and has connections here. So kind of a cool thing. And if you're a part of Center Church watching this right now, some of you may remember Clint actually spoke in 2009 when our church met at Zion Christian School. And so fast forward 11 years later, here we are having this conversation. So thanks, Clint. Good
Yeah,
morning.
great to be with you, man. It's funny. I was just thinking, man, you don't get many sunny afternoons in West Michigan, do you?
No, really true. It is very true. And it's good. It was like pouring rain all day, and now it's very sunny. So I'll take it.
Yeah.
So just for
Spent a bit of time
context,
around West Michigan. My wife Jamie is American, and she grew up mostly around West Michigan, so over on the lakeshore side. So grew up in Holland, a lot of years in Holland, and then Spring Lake, over by Grand Haven there. So know the area well. Spent a bit of time around Grand Rapids, and so yeah, it's great to be with you.
yeah. And extra special thanks again if you're not familiar with time changes and time zones, Clint. It's what time is it in Christchurch where you're at now?
8 a.m. Saturday morning.
Cool. This is the first time I've ever interviewed someone from the future.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you have tons of those jokes ready. So either way, well, I want to jump right into our conversation as people are joining us because I think there's a lot of things that we can learn not only from you but just like the actual discipline and practice of wisdom. And but we've been talking about this whole series in terms of weird habits, and what we're trying to develop in spiritual disciplines are holy habits, but all of us have some pretty weird habits. So I've been kind of sharing some of mine. Like I've got a strict breakfast routine. I eat the same thing every day, almost in the same place every day now that I think about it, which is a little bit weird for me. Now it's almost like a religious thing. And I won't do certain things in the rest of my day without that part. So it's like a keystone. I've got to have that locked in. Real quick, just to get people introduced to your weird habits, give me one or two that are just like, this is kind of weird.
Yeah. You said this question through in advance, and I was like, oh man, there's so many. Like I think I'm a little bit quirky in a lot of different ways, but one in particular that drives my family a bit nuts is I'm always like bouncing my legs. So like I'm always shaking my leg or bouncing my leg or whatnot. And so when we're at the dinner table or whatnot, they're all complaining that it's shaking all their seats and the table and all that stuff. I don't know. I don't. It's not really like a conscious thing. It's not something I learned and developed or whatever. It's more unconscious. Like I don't even realize that I'm doing it. Or like when I go to bed at night, we're heading into winter now, so it's starting to get colder at night. So we've got all the blankets on the bed, and we don't have central heating in our house like people do, and New Zealand's a bit different in that. So we got like lots of blankets on the bed to stay warm, and I have this thing where I gotta like the sheet, there's the sheet and then all the blankets. Like I got to get the sheet like out and curled over the top of the blankets. You know what I mean? That's just a weird thing. I don't know if anyone else does that, but like that sense of like feeling like Jamie doesn't care as much. She just jumps into bed and like gets in and gets warm, and so like I do this like that's kind of like my going to bed ritual, I guess, where I'm like I gotta get things like organized and settled, and you know.
That is equally as weird, but I understand it because Lindsay and I have a constant battle in our house about me pulling the sheets up too high, and eventually they start coming up from the back. So anyway, we could probably talk all day about just these, but I want to ask you, and you kind of alluded to it. So probably most people watching this are watching this here in Michigan, or at least in America. As someone who's married to an American, but not American by birth. You were born in Australia. How are you viewing what's happening in America right now? Like, how would you kind of describe us to ourselves, if that makes sense? Especially as someone who's a pastor, done a lot of study, lived in America as well. Like, you have so many overlaps, but at the same time, you have a different perspective. Can you let us in on that?
Oh man. I feel like that's a dangerous question to answer. You kind of, um, yeah. So I mean, obviously married to an American, and I moved over to get married, and we stayed. We were there for 10 years, so we lived 6 years in Indianapolis, but the family was back in Michigan, so we come back to West Michigan regularly, and then 4 years out in New Jersey, out on the East Coast, where so we yeah, so I feel like I have a good sense of that, but we've been out now for 8 years. So, and it feels like in those 8 years, America has changed drastically. It feels like a very different place when I come back now to visit than when we left. It's a little over 8 years ago now since we left, and it feels very different. And one of the biggest things, this probably isn't surprising to anyone, is just the polarized nature of things, where things are so disconnected and so divided, and people take such almost extremist views and positions on things. And so I think that's probably safe-ish ground to just acknowledge like that like that's happening, and plenty of people are talking about that and recognizing that. But I think what we're seeing now, actually, with this, the pandemic and the COVID-19 crisis we're living through, is we're seeing some of how dangerous that divide can become, in the sense of, and particularly real for us, here in New Zealand, with family and lots of loved ones and friends back in the States who we care deeply about. We're looking at things going, man, this is really concerning, in the sense that, like, here in New Zealand, we're actually in a coordinated, slow reopening phase, where we've got very few new cases. We've like New Zealand's done really well, but that was because they went really hard and really early on shutting things down. We were in full lockdown nationwide for 4 weeks, and then a very slow staging out of that kind of thing. And it took a collective approach where everyone got on board. So it stripped away all the politics, it stripped away all the divisions, it stripped away all that stuff, and said we need to unite her and beat this thing. And we watched our country just kind of do that. And I just don't know if that's even feasible or possible in the US, because of these long ingrained divisions and polarized. So you can't have a sense of a united effort. And so you continue to see, so I think there's some of that is really concerning when it comes around these massive issues that are affecting so many people, like a COVID crisis, right? Where it'd be, it's just concerning, right? And a little bit dangerous to see, how do you respond well? How do you have a collective response and approach to something? And anyway, so that's just kind of, I don't know, something that we've been looking at and thinking about, being removed from. Anyway, I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Yeah,
it's concerning.
it is helpful. I think it's an interesting thing too, because we're going to get into talking about how do you actually practice wisdom? How do you be a wise person? Because one of the things I think all of us would recognize, no matter what spectrum we're on politically, or even just on the crisis itself, or how to handle it, and economic effects and impact and all those things, is that all of us want to be more wise. Like, you could ask every single person, especially in our church, like right now, what do you want? You'd be dumb not to say want to be more wise. But at the same time, we're bombarded with multiple different media outlets. We have doctors on Instagram saying this, and then you have a doctor post a video the next day on Facebook saying something totally the opposite. You got a bunch of theories out there, lots of memes. There's just a ton of information and content out there. And I'd love to ask you if you can help us process, how do you find wisdom? How do you practice wisdom? And even to figure out, like, how do I discern what the wise thing, what the true thing is during this rapidly changing time?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, as a rule of thumb, when you start seeing all those, vastly different things popping up all over the show, like, I immediately just go, okay, what do we know? We know things are uncertain, and people don't know what's going on, right? Like, and to, I think sometimes just naming that reality, like it takes a level of humility, right? Because people want to feel like they know what's going on, want to feel like they're in charge and all that kind of stuff. But to name that and go, hey, these are uncertain times, and even the experts are still grasping, it feels like, to try and get their heads and hands around this thing, to know what does it mean, what are the implications, and people don't have all the answers. And I think just naming that and going, this is what it is, this is what we know, is a helpful place. It kind of just levels the field to go, okay, so rather than, and it helps you not put too much stock or too much weight in one person's opinion or one person's advice, if that makes sense. And it allows you just to kind of like step back and almost create that, not that like not that it's even possible to get completely objective, but it allows you to get a little bit more objectivity, to kind of just step back, remove some of the like right in your face kind of emotion, and you know, like I love emotion and stuff, but like remove some of that from it, and passion, you know, kind of, and just go step back and go, you know what? It seems like there's no sense of consistency or consensus here. So where do we, you know, what's actually most helpful, and what's not, you know, because there's a lot of stuff coming through that's just not helpful. And I think if we that's just a, I find a good practice or good habit to go, okay, this is uncertain, doesn't seem like there's any kind of sense of this is making sense. If people are just kind of scattershot, so to speak, to go, okay, it's uncertain, no answers. You know, I'm okay living in uncertainty. I know a lot of people are really uncomfortable with that, and that causes anxiety for, you know, at high levels, and that kind of thing. I think in those times, you know, finding you couple of close people in your life who you can say, hey, look, it seems like things are really uncertain. That makes me feel really anxious. You know, can we talk about this? What are you finding helpful? What are you know, who are the helpful voices in this situation? Who are the unhelpful? And you just run a filter, right? And so helping other people, if you're feeling out of your depth in running that filter, finding one or two other people who can help you run that filter. And I think that's a wise practice, you know.
Yeah. And that's what we're after. I think that's key. And I know a lot of people have said this to our church. I'm sure you've said it to your church, and just where you're at. Like, a lot of people are watching how we respond to these crises and making decisions about Jesus. And they're making decisions about our churches, and they're making decisions about, do we really believe what we say we believe? How have you found that when like, I want to press on that more, because when the emotions are high, I think it's way easier to kind of leave behind wisdom and get into react mode. How are you leading your people in your church through that? I think that would be an interesting thing for us to learn from as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think the really the key, I mean, for me is, when I reflect on my own life, my own leadership, when I start feeling really quite defensive, so to speak, you know, if I start feeling easily offended or defensive or whatnot, that signals to me inside of me that something's being triggered here. I need to figure out what's going on for me and take responsibility for me, which is different than the situation, if that makes sense. So you know, I talk monthly. We have a practice here in New Zealand called Supervision. So I have an external supervisor who's like a counselor. He's, you know, trained psychologist and counselor and all that kind of stuff. And I talk with him monthly, but he does like monthly supervision, which he defines supervision as the disciplined reflection on practice. So basically, you know, if I'm in leadership mode and I find myself being like these things coming up inside of me, that's the place where I take those things and I unpack them with him, and he helps me understand why, maybe, you know, we unpack why those things might be triggering for me, where and how it's unhelpful actually in the situation for me to then come out like doubling down on certain things, or just, nailing certain decisions. So so I have to kind of take responsibility for me first, would be the thing I'd say. And then the second thing is like, I don't know, our team, we're really quite fortunate here. Our team has really been great in navigating through this time where it hasn't been really difficult. I think our church has been, we've got great team of wise leaders, godly leaders who are wise and discerning and prayerful, and so we do just kind of walk a little slower through times like this, and our church have really responded well. So we're praying lots, we're talking regularly, so we're on a much more frequent meeting schedule at the moment with we call them our servant leaders, which is our board, or whatever you might call them in different churches. So we're meeting a lot more frequently, we're talking a lot more regularly, just so we're staying, because things are changing so quickly. And so we're, rather than getting fully caught up in all of those, that's probably and we're helping just balance each other, and regulate each other through, because there are some times where we go, and we're having those kind of honest conversations with each other where we're saying, well, help me understand, why are you saying, no, we shouldn't do that? Why are you saying that? Help me understand that. Is that a fear-based reaction? Is that a fear-based response? Or is that like more of a Holy Spirit-led reaction and response? And just kind of running those kind of questions are really helpful, because a lot of people, their reactions are out of the fear base, and we know God doesn't give us a spirit of fear. That's not one of the fruit of the Spirit. That's not a holy habit you want to be practicing or developing. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or not. I think I can
No, it makes
a
sense.
little bit.
I think too, knowing you for a while and kind of watching your own journey, and we shared your bio with our church. A lot of people know, like, you have a doctorate, you've gone through so many levels of education, studied around the world, like, but even all those things aside, I think you'd probably agree, like I do, that practicing wisdom and growing in spiritual maturity and being able to discern the times is actually essential in growing as a disciple of Jesus, not just kind of a luxury. Some people have it, some people don't. Some people have the ability to discern truth, some people don't. You'd actually probably say it's essential. Why is that essential? I mean, obviously we see that in the book of Acts, full of wisdom and the Holy Spirit over and over again. But why do you feel like in this time that to truly be a disciple of Jesus, you have to learn to practice wisdom?
I mean, I think it's critical, because the reality is, and this was true even pre-COVID, right? I mean, like, the reality is our world is getting faster, more complicated, complex, even with, like, globally, education being on the rise, like, even in the developing world, where much more people have access to education now than ever before, things like that. It means that the kinds of questions people are asking, the kinds of issues people are facing, and challenges are getting more complicated, and it's all just moving a lot faster as well. And I don't know that, how else would you navigate a world like that? You know what I mean? Like, I think wisdom's essential. And when you read the scriptures, I mean, over and over and over again, you read the first 2 chapters of Proverbs, the repeating, it's almost like a drum beat through there, the metronome, the thing over and over and over again says, get wisdom, get insight, whatever it takes, get these things, go for it, and we need it, and it helps us to be, and so here's why I think it's so important is wisdom. We know wisdom from the wisdom literature in the scriptures, which emerged really in the Old Testament in particular out of ancient Israel, where there was really, it was embedded in their worldview. So we don't necessarily have the same wisdom worldview that they did, but we can learn a lot from them and how they operated. They operated and functioned out of a place where they recognize the entire universe is created and designed by God. It is ordered by God, and the way in which we live skillfully, we live well in this world, is by following, is living in this is the fear of the Lord, where it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. They say this is what it looks like. Well, what is the fear of the Lord? That's living in reverence and respect. And really, I think the key to it is humility. We can talk about that a lot more in a couple of minutes, but I think this is what it's all about. And the truth is, our world is created. God is still sovereign and in control and large and all of that. And we would do well to live life as close as we can to the way in which he designed and functioned for us to live. So like even in the scriptures, I mean, they talk about this is how you live well. This is how you live skillfully, with skill. And it's less about knowing the most information and being the smartest person in the room. That's not the key to wisdom. The key to wisdom is knowing how to use whatever information you have in any given moment or situation. So the old adage, like the classic phrase of, you can, what is it? Information tells you that tomatoes are fruit, but wisdom tells you don't put tomato in your fruit salad, right? So, that's kind of the classic thing. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, we can know a bunch of things, but it's how you use what you know that's most helpful in times like this. So I don't know if that's helpful or
Yeah, no,
answering your question.
I want to keep pressing on that because I think one of the things that people, I'll say it this way, a lot of the voices that are loudest that we're listening to right now, even just in response to this pandemic, are claiming to be wise, but are rarely humble. So talk to us about that. Why can you not be truly wise as a disciple of Christ without that humility? Why do those go together for us?
Well, okay, so let's start with the Old Testament. I mean, so in the Old Testament, wisdom is talked about in terms of, yes, you can get wisdom, you can gain it. It's something you can learn and develop and all that kind of stuff. So there's this sense of potentiality in that's exciting and energizing and draws us into it, to seek it, to pursue it, that kind of thing. But it also acknowledges a limitation, and it holds these two things together in tension with each other. Yes, as humans, we have the potential to gain wisdom and understanding and all that kind of stuff, but never perfect wisdom. Only God has perfect wisdom. So that's the limitation piece, and that holds it in restriction. So built into, kind of ancient Israel and their old kind of worldview was this tension of human potential, but also recognizing human limitation. The minute you start doing away with that kind of limitation piece, and you start realizing, anything's possible and humans can do all, and that kind of stuff, and you remove that limitation piece, it's hard to be humble, right? So I think there's actually something, and our Christian, the Christian tradition's great in reminding us of our human limitations, like the whole journey through Lent, just before Easter, that 40-day period of reminding ourselves that we are, Ash Wednesday begins with the, from dust you came, to dust you will return, reminding us of the finality of our limitations and all that as human beings. I think that's key to understanding humility, that's just embedded in the world in which we live. So we can never know or have perfect wisdom. That's God's and God's alone. And so it draws us into seeking that from God as the source of wisdom, rather than, and allowing that to be the primary filter. So, when we talk about how you develop wisdom, one of the things that I learned through my research and my study is actually humility is the number one thing, like forming a godly character. So like this whole series of like holy habits that you're kind of working through, that's essential. Like forming that sense of an inner life that is rooted and completely dependent upon God, and God first, and God foundational, and God is the source, and God, like that is critical to understanding wisdom, to gaining wisdom. Like that's really where it all starts and grows from, is that sense of godly character formation, and humility is essential. Over and over and over again, you see in the Proverbs, right? If you're reading through Proverbs, it says, the arrogant, the proud, they're the fools. The wise and the wise ones are the humble ones, don't. And so it holds up humility as this thing to be taught, this thing to learn, this thing to foster and develop. And you know, to be honest, going through study, that's been really, for me in my journey, like that's actually, I think, been really helpful. You got to learn. You learn pretty quick, right? When you get faced with all this reading load, and then you have to turn around and write some stuff, and you know, you get feedback on paper. You learn pretty quickly, like, oh, maybe I'm not as clever as I thought I was, or maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was, and there's a good thing to that. And I think the more broadly that, you know, I've read, and the more things that I've encountered, I go, you know, yeah, invested years and years into study, and I love, you know, I think I've gained a lot through that, but one of the things I've gained the most is I've learned how little I actually do know. Now I want to be stewarding well all that God's entrusted to me and given to me, all that kind of stuff, but um and think I do have things to offer and contribute. I'm not, you know, totally dismissing all of that, but really it fosters this sense of teachability and humility and openness to say, maybe I don't have the final answer on things. Maybe I don't fully understand it, all the nuanced stuff here. Um, I don't know if that's helpful, but that's, I think, really critical, and has been helpful for me as I go.
Yeah.
And even freeing at some level to feel like I can move forward without having full understanding and answers. You know, like I don't know about your experience with study, but that's one thing. Like through study, you go, there's always something more you could read. There's always something more you could include in that final paper. You know what I mean? It's never actually done, but you still got to submit, right? You got to. There's a deadline. You got a due date that you need to turn it in, and you know what I mean. So you got to move forward at some point, and that, I think, there's those are the kinds of things that I think foster good humility in it.
Yeah, that's huge. I wonder too, and if you're watching this live with us, feel free. We're going to take a minute here in just a second to actually grab some questions live. And we've got a few questions throughout the week leading up to this conversation with Clint. So if your question hasn't been submitted or you didn't get a chance to ask it, please put it in the comments. We'll make sure I'll be watching it as we're going. But one of the questions that came up, and it really relates to a question I sent you, like how do you actually practice wisdom and grow in that habit in this rapidly changing time? So many of our social media channels, our TVs, our phones, our workplaces are full of what feels like just an overload of information.
Yeah,
And social media has quickly become where you basically post your latest theories or share the latest theories on the response to the virus. Is it real? Is it not? How are governments doing? Like we can just easily get caught up in that. Can you talk to us about the role of social media and just how we should approach news during this time where things are so quick to change, and keeping humility as a part of that? How do you approach that?
um, yeah. I think there's a level of obsession that can creep in that's really unhealthy. So I found myself as well when things were changing really fast. I found myself feeling overwhelmed, and you know, like constantly checking what's the latest update, what's the and I actually, you know, our government have handled this thing pretty well, you know, to be honest. And so when I started feeling like, and the inner chaos, and I found my inner world starting to feel quite disturbed, you know, it was like things were bubbling up and just kind of like at this heightened sense. Um, and that's when I realized I need to unplug. I need to step back. I need to distance myself a lot from it. So, you know, I mean, for some time now, I don't have Facebook on my phone. I don't have, you know, like things like that. Like I don't do a lot of social media checking. And so I just started limiting myself to, you know what, I'm going to check the news once a day. Um, and our you know, our government, they would do like a 1 p.m. media press conference type thing, through the thick of it. So and it really only took me kind of, you know, after about a week probably, where things were so chaotic and so in turmoil, and I'm like, this is unsustainable for me. I'm not going to be able to lead well, because the way media works and the way social media works is people are like, they're giving their reactionary responses. So as people pump out like something on social media, if you actually went back to them an hour later after things had kind of, settled a little bit, like they may not fully have, you know, they may have still said content-wise something similar to what they put out, but it may have been stripped with a lot of the extremism that was attached to it. You know what I mean? So social media is almost like it's got this, when it's like in the moment and you punch it out and throw it out there kind of thing. It's got all the heat and sting still attached to it, and sometimes it's hard to see past that to what's actually true. So I actually find social media a less helpful way to find news. I go to the source, and as close to the source as possible. So even media outlets. So I started actually just going to our government's straight to the source. You know what I mean? Like rather than, because even media outlets, right? Like you're getting a bit of a slant. You're getting someone's interpretation of events. You're getting and especially when they're trying to crank things out as quickly as possible, you might get slight misinformation, or they might have misunderstood actually what was said, and so you get these misinterpretations, which then get exploded up and like misquoted and misattributed and all that stuff. And so I'm like, if I could just like get cut through all of that, so getting to the source as close as possible, that was really helpful for me, and limiting the amount of time I'm looking at it. Those were two practices that I found really quite helpful in staying more balanced and more objective. And I don't know if that makes sense. But
It's interesting. It's one thing I've been reminded of during this time. It's almost easy to forget this, which is funny to say that out loud. Every news agency has a bottom line, and it's not your best interest, probably.
no, that's right. Yeah.
There's that, and even if you find your obscure kind of not-for-profit news person, we're all selfish by just bent, and so without Christ filling our hearts with wisdom and being surrendered to that, even the way we engage that kind of content can be destructive to our own soul and our own holy habits. So, yeah. That's really, really interesting. Talk to the person who's watching who, for the last 30 minutes, says, yeah, I buy in. I need to practice wisdom. I need to learn how to create this habit in my own life. What are some real practical next steps you would say? Here's where I would start, at least trying to cultivate this, especially if someone has like no idea where to start, where do I go, what needs to change in their personal lives.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think take the charge of the scriptures where it says seek wisdom, make that your motto. Say, all right, I'm after godly wisdom. I'm not interested in worldly wisdom. I'm after godly wisdom. And so that starts with asking God. James 1:5 says, if any of you lack wisdom, ask God for it. And he loves to give good gifts to us. So he will give it to you. Now, it's not necessarily, you can't think of wisdom as like a static deposit that you ask for it once and you get it and you're good for life. It's something that you got to cultivate and you got to learn, and you got to learn it. Like I actually, a good friend of mine said, it's like you got to, it's almost like developing an artistic sensibility rather than a scientific approach. It's more art than science, where a developing artist learns proportion and color and all those kinds of things by being alongside a great artist, by spending lots of time around art. You know what I mean? That's how you develop and you cultivate almost like a sense of taste for this is how you cultivate a life of wisdom. So make that kind of your mantra, where you just claim and you pray James 1:5 over and over and over. Start with prayer and finish with prayer. Prayer, that dependency on God, that's what we see all the way affirmed throughout. So prayer is huge. I know you've already done a session on prayer, but make that, ask God for it, and He will give it to you. The second thing I'd say is develop some form of reflective practice, where maybe for you it's like I'd said, you've got a very kind of formalized relationship with someone, like a counselor or a friend or whoever you talk to. Find someone godly and wise, who you can talk to and have that disciplined form of reflective practice. Maybe for you it's journaling. That's been another one for me, where I've had to just pull back and say, I need to hear God's wisdom on this. I need to hear God's voice piercing through all the other noises and all the other voices right now. running for me has been a huge, I know you like your running, John. Running for me has been a huge way for me to do that, actually. I think, that sense of being away. I'm not one who listens to music or podcasts much when I'm running. I'm usually that's a good time for me to process and be in prayer and having conversation with the Lord. And then I'd say, look for multiple varied wise voices, and read widely would be my other thing. So don't go narrow, read widely as you're reading. And in particular, I'd encourage reading, and this is a hard one, especially for younger people, because they go, oh, I'm not much of a reader. I'm like, well, start. Become one, because it'll serve you well. I promise you, it'll serve you well. And I would encourage, read some of the Christian classics. Like, those have been so huge for me. When you get around someone like A.W. Tozer's, Pursuit of God's been a classic for me. That, C.S. Lewis. You get some of these kind of devotional classics, that over years have just been so good. And so those, get into some of those Christian classics, and Christian biographies would be the other thing. Like, really good Christian biographies. Read some things like that. And it just gives you that sense of a life that's centered in Christ, that's founded fully in God, and a life that's lived well. There's something that in all of that allows, I don't know, it just kind of helps center me again. So praying, reflective, find some discipline of reflection, reading widely, so that you're not relying totally on your own experience or your own interpretations, but you're gleaning from the best of others, and other people's, sometimes their analysis of situations, their analysis of things. Those are kind of some of the, and the humility piece of being willing to be wrong. So learning from your mistakes, and owning when you do make mistakes. That sense of, the Proverbs over and over and over again say, the fool is the one who resists correction or resists discipline. The wise embrace it. So I think that'd be a couple of next steps.
Another question I got throughout this week, and again, if you're just joining us kind of end of the game, feel free to comment. We'll try to fill in one more question. But one of the questions I had this week is, what do you do? How should you respond when you receive information that your brain processes as true, but it doesn't line up with what you believe is true? How should you interact with those two things? So so Clint, if you can tell us if COVID's a conspiracy or not, we'll get into that one next. But no, I'm kidding. We're not going to try to tap into that. But seriously, people are probably facing that kind of, like, they were at kind of equilibrium, and then you get a thing that your brain says, there's no way this can be true, but everything objectively checks all the boxes, but it doesn't line up with what you thought was true. Maybe it, again, related to this virus or just in life. How do you respond to those? I got that kind of interact with that question in conversation a couple times this week. How would you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And it does come up, especially in situations like this. So I think, for people, I think just to normalize that a little bit and say that's normal, and increasingly common. So I think to acknowledge that, and then I think taking that, don't sit with it alone. Take it to, who are those? Take it to God. Obviously, take it to God. In prayer. Seek God's wisdom on it. What does God say about this? How do we make sense of it? And sometimes you gotta look to the, like, I think, like you said, doing a little unpacking of the source. Like, where has this come from? What's the motivation behind, is there an underlying agenda or motivation? What's the context out of which this information comes? How trustworthy is it? All those kind of questions. But then also having just conversation with good, wise, godly people to try and make sense of it. While then at the same time recognizing the humility piece of saying, we're never going to have perfect wisdom. We're never going to fully know and understand, and things are never going to always line up ideally. You know what I mean? Like, yes, we can do a lot and we can understand a lot and we can practice that, and let's be wise and diligent in that, the human potential side of things, but also recognizing the human limitations, and keeping those in tension. You get in trouble if you go too far one way or the other. If you fully embrace limitation and go, well, I've just check my brain at the door, I'm not going to think about stuff, I'm not going to work hard to figure it, do any of that diligence type work, that's problematic. And then so is the opposite. If you just figure all, and this person must be 100% accurate, 100% right. So anything, I guess bottom line would be anything you can do to create more of an objective stance on it, rather than getting so caught up and wrapped up in things. Feelings aren't always to be trusted. Feelings can mislead and can be unhelpful.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was just thinking about, we talked about James 1, but James 1:19, dear brothers and sisters, take note, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. I think the more you practice wisdom, the more that those things define your response to the latest article or the neighbor who gets up in your grill about something or whatever. Like, there's so many different opportunities to practice wisdom. So any kind of final words, and then I'd love for you just to pray over us, pray over those who are watching, pray over those who are trying to wrestle with, how do I practice wisdom in this time?
No, other than good on you, man, for doing this. I think this is a great use of the season and practicing forming holy habits. So I think you're leading your people well. Those who are joining, I'm hoping it's been helpful. And just want to encourage you guys. It's worth the pursuit. God will meet you in it. God will find you in it, and He'll hold you through it. So
yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. I totally agree. This has been good just for me. It was good for me to sit down and reflect on this in my own life. So thanks for doing some pro bono counseling in the process. I appreciate it. Would you pray for us? Close out our time.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah,
thanks.
God, thanks for this moment and this opportunity, this moment where we recognize you are still present, you are still with us, you are still holding things, you are still sovereign. And so we recognize you, the living God, in this moment. And God, I pray for each person listening, those who have tuned in and been on this journey. Lord, I pray, like as James encourages us, God, grant us your wisdom in this moment. We know we need it. We know we don't have all the answers. We don't fully understand. We recognize our limitations in this moment. And God, more than anything, we want to hear your voice. We want to know your understanding of the situation. We want to know how to process, how to respond. We don't want to be too reactionary, but we want to be responsive. So help us to walk that right balance. Lord, I do pray for each person here for moments where they find in that moments of reflection where they can step back a minute and allow your Holy Spirit to guide, direct their thoughts, direct their words, even help reshape emotions and feelings. I pray. God, lead us into truth, your truth. We recognize you are the ultimate source of all truth. We want to understand to the best of our abilities, but also recognize that only you hold perfect and ultimate wisdom. So I pray a blessing on each one here today. God, would you make us increasingly wise people? And would that ultimately be a testimony to the greatness of who you are, Jesus, your goodness, your love for us? And would we be people who shine your light as a way to just navigate well and wisely through crazy times? I pray, that we would represent you well in this moment. Bless John and all those at Center Church. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, thanks again, Clint. This has been awesome. Appreciate you waking up early, interrupting your Saturday morning routine to hang out with us for a little bit. It's pretty awesome of you.
Pleasure. Glad to.
Awesome. Well, thanks, everybody. We will see you Sunday morning if you're part, or if you're just watching this, tune in. Feel free to add questions in the comments. We want to make sure that we're resourcing you in this time, too. So thanks again, Clint, for being a real helpful voice for us. A lot of people saying thank you. A lot of exclamation points are being sent out right now in the chat. So Thank you. Seriously, appreciate it. All right. That'll do it.